I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. Growing up, I would have probably been the least likely person to be here. And it's because of ecosystem builders like you and like myself now that there's been a huge shift in my trajectory from what is called an at-risk kid growing up in inner city Chicago to becoming a Fortune 500 VP at Google and then creating my own venture capital firm. And I want to share a bit about that story because it's really difficult to become something that we can't see, something that we've never seen, that we have no examples of. And I think all of you in your ecosystems have kids like me that are growing up and wondering what they can be. Growing up, the ecosystem that I grew up with was not working in my favor. My parents came here from Puerto Rico. They were migrant farm workers. I was conceived in Florida and born in New York State. They moved to Chicago when I was 2 so that we could try to go to one school a year. They became factory workers, and for a time, my mom even worked as an office worker. The schools that I went to weren't perfect. I remember in kindergarten, one of my teachers humiliated me for speaking Spanish to help a child who didn't speak any English understand what was going on in the classroom. Another time when I asked if the teacher could recommend books by Puerto Rican writers, she told me that Puerto Ricans don't write books. But it was also in school that I came into contact with some of the guardian angels of my life. And I bless them to this day. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of them. One of them was Marcia Weinstein. She was my 6th grade English teacher. And Marcia Weinstein bought 35 kids books with her own money. She bought us The Grapes of Wrath, Oliver Twist, and The Jungle. Now, if any of you have read these books, you'll remember that they're all about kids growing up in poverty, many of them without any safe adults in their lives. And those books became a vehicle for her to teach us reading, vocabulary, textual analysis, critical thinking, and writing. But more than that, she taught us about life through those books. That was the first time I heard the words, the human condition. Now, the stories are all about people that have to decide in really difficult circumstances, how will they respond to the people around them, and how will they choose to live their own lives? She really emphasized that we understand and be compassionate towards people given the difficulties of their circumstances, but she also challenged us to determine for ourselves what our life would be and to be resilient in the face of those circumstances. Another teacher in 7th grade was the first person to tell me that I should be a lawyer. And that also meant that she presumed I'd go to college. And she didn't just tell me this, she basically showed me about scholarships and helped me get a scholarship. I got a scholarship through a Better Chance program to which she introduced me, and I went to private high school. It was in private high school that the trajectory of my life started shifting. Now, one of the things that happened in addition to having a really tremendous liberal arts education is that I was given the opportunity to take computer science and coding, or required to take computer science and coding, for 3 years of high school. Now, I might look like Beyonce, but I'm really not that young. So I want to say that that was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, I was studying computer science and coding. They didn't even have personal computers yet. This was still microcomputers. And the thing about that is it's something that, to this day, most public schools do not require, 40 years later. My daughter went to a girls' private school. She was in middle school having 3 years of computer science and 1 year of entrepreneurship training in middle school. Now, there are mayors in a lot of cities that are working with their school superintendents to change this for their kids. We see this in Houston and Oakland, but we need to see it everywhere. We need kids to actually be learning the skills of the present day and of the future. Now, when I was growing up, we had a number of difficult circumstances. My parents had grown up in violent homes, and we had a lot of domestic violence in our home, and we kids were even abused. So when my parents split up, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it did mean that we went from being working class to working poor. My mom had less than an 8th grade education at that time, and 5 children to raise. We went from living in a predominantly Puerto Rican community that was working class with typically 2 parent households, working person in the home, small neighborhood stores that were run by Puerto Rican neighbors. We moved to another neighborhood that was gang infested, full of drugs, violence, gun violence at that time even, and where a lot of households had no parents who'd actually ever worked. Now, this neighborhood was so tough that one time Hill Street Blues used our L stop as a background location. My brother got to be an extra, so he got his 15 seconds of fame on Hill Street Blues. But it wasn't just the neighborhood that was tough. Like a lot of kids that are growing up in your communities, my life was tough. During the time between when my parents split up and I graduated from college, 2 of my siblings dropped out of high school. 2 of them had children while they were in their teens. They struggled with drugs and homelessness. 1 of my siblings was incarcerated. My mother lost her brother to alcohol, to the streets, and ultimately he died a violent death in the streets. So there were a lot of things happening in my environment while I was trying to be a high honor student and go to college. And I always think about the support and help of the ecosystem builders around me, because I don't think it would have been possible for me to do this. Talent and hard work is just not enough. Now, the ecosystem builders that I had around me, they encouraged me in so many different ways. And you and the work that you're doing in your community is helping kids like me to have the chance to actually stand up on this stage one day. The kinds of things that were really helpful were, I got Head Start when I was growing up. I also learned to speak English, partly because of that Head Start program. And people like you that were working in the mayor's office in Chicago created summer jobs programs for low-income youth. And one of the first jobs that I had in college was actually in 1983. The mayor's office of Chicago had an internship program where people could learn about the personal computer and learn to use it and its operating system and understand the hardware, and also use the first software packages that were created for the personal computer. So they also had us do visits to companies where we got to see how technology got used at those companies. Now that summer job was really sowing some seeds that later on became a really important part of my career, because I didn't turn out to be a computer coder. What I turned out to be was a deal maker that helped technology companies monetize their technology, understand how to commercialize and sell it to other people. So the work that you're doing is really important. The context in which I grew up is also important. Some of you are working on these same kinds of things, but when I was growing up, I happened to come up at the tail end of a really good period of history. And it's kind of interesting, but in the first decade in which I was alive, we passed the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We passed the Equal Pay Act in 1962. We passed Title IX in 1972. We also had Roe v. Wade. We had, well, before my time, Brown versus the Board of Education, and a number of cases that really helped minorities and women be able to aspire to be in the workforce and to be paid equally and to make a contribution in their communities outside the home. For me, that led me to eventually go to Stanford. Now, Stanford is in itself an unusual ecosystem. A study that was funded in part by the Kauffman Foundation showed that Stanford University, if it were looked at as an economy, would be the 10th largest economy in the world. The 10th largest economy in the world. Now, how is that? With a population of about 250,000 alumni, Stanford University has created over 40,000 companies, most of which are within an hour's drive of the university. If all of those companies were really one country, they themselves would form the 10th largest economy in the world. Now, one of the things that's behind that tremendous statistic is the ecosystem of Stanford University. I came to Stanford sight unseen. Obviously, I had no networks whatsoever in California or in the technology sector. But we have a culture at Stanford of collaboration. And over the course of my career, I have been able to call on alumni any number of times, from the time I was an undergraduate to when I was running Google Legal to being a venture capitalist. And I have to say that of the times that I've made a request to that ecosystem, I have had a positive response more than 85% of the time. It's that kind of collaboration that has made Silicon Valley what it is. It's what allows people from diverse communities like myself to be able to integrate into that community and be able to become contributors to that community. Now, Silicon Valley isn't perfect. We've all read the statistics about diversity, sexual harassment, and I myself have experienced a lot of that growing up in Silicon Valley. At the startup that I started in the late 90s with 4 engineers from Stanford, one of whom was my husband, I was basically kicked to the curb by our VCs who didn't want the wife of a husband and wife team. Now, that was after I'd had a child on Friday and came back to work on Monday. So I don't think you could question my commitment. But that wasn't the worst thing that happened. In fact, it turned out to be a really great thing because ultimately I landed at Google, where I became the second attorney and the commercial deal maker for the company. I was able to hire a team of the most talented and diverse attorneys in the US. And that's according to American Lawyer magazine, not just my personal opinion. Now, that team and I worked on the first $14 billion worth of revenue at Google, and that was just in the first 5 years. I was able to work on multi-billion-dollar transactions during my time there and help to build a really iconic company. That was a tremendous opportunity. It also allowed me to found Gulu Ventures, which is a seed stage venture capital firm. It's majority, minority, and woman-led by me. And I've made over 100 investments in entrepreneurs through Gulu Ventures. Our first fund is a top decile or top 10% fund for its vintage. Our second fund is going well. It's too early to tell, but one of the characteristics of that fund is that it is a diverse fund. We have about a third of our CEOs are women, about 30% of our CEOs are minority, and about 10% of our entrepreneur co-founders are underrepresented minorities. We also have immigrants. We have everybody. Now, you'll probably hear a theme there. What's all this about diversity? Well, diverse organizations tend to outperform less diverse organizations financially. So part of my, there's method in this madness is that my intention is to be a top decile fund, and I'm going to accomplish that by investing in diverse entrepreneurs. Now, our first criteria is always financial. Really, we can't succeed if we aren't financially successful and we don't return good returns to our investors. And we use a quantitative approach to decision making, though, that allows us to apply consistent criteria across companies. That means that we are less likely than others to deny entrepreneurs on the basis of unconscious bias. And we end up with a pool that's more representative of what is actually in the technology centers of Silicon Valley. So Gulu Ventures has allowed me to make a different kind of contribution as a part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think it's something that we can all agree has become a worldwide phenomenon. I have traveled, in part because of the Kauffman Fellows program, to ecosystems throughout the US and the world. I have been to ecosystems in Puerto Rico, Mexico, Brazil, China, the UAE, Singapore, Indonesia, and on and on. Now, American entrepreneurship is the hope for all these countries, even the richest ones. And it's amazing to me when I see different accelerators and incubators in various parts of the world, including Israel and Palestine, and the amazing things that have been accomplished in sometimes 20 to 50 years through these communities. Now, we have so much at our disposal because we are a nation that has been at the frontier. We are a nation of immigrants. Almost all of us who are not Native American came here from another place. We had to learn different languages. We had to move across the frontier and make our own lives. Now, this knowledge of entrepreneurship and this know-how is something that we can and should be applying in our local communities. And it's a kind of an institutional knowledge that we cannot lose because the world is changing. We know that technology will disrupt and make obsolete millions of jobs in the next few decades. Entrepreneurs will always have work. And work is really important because human beings are creative beings. We need to make things with our hands, with our words, with our minds. And if we don't change the mindset that we are all capable of being entrepreneurs, identifying problems that we can solve, and becoming problem solvers, we just won't make it as a nation or as an economy. One thing that I was surprised to learn recently is that New York City is now the 25th largest city in the world. Only the 25th largest city in the world. We are a small country among countries that are getting bigger and wealthier. We are a diverse country, which also gives us an advantage in that global marketplace. Why? Because we have everything here that's out there. We have all of the languages, all of the cultures. We have all of the wisdom of their cultures and the ways of doing business in their countries right here at home. Really, the world market is ours to lose, because there is no other country like ours that will pretty soon have no ethnic or racial majority. We have, more than any other country, been one that learns how to work with difference. And that is a tremendous opportunity in a market that is just becoming more global all the time. So I want to encourage all of you, because the work you're doing is so important. It makes such a difference in people's lives. It's made a tremendous difference in my life and my community. It's made me have the opportunity to give my full potential to the world. And I'm not done yet. I want to thank you for being here, for the work that you're doing, and also thank the Kauffman Foundation for having me here today, and Kansas City for hosting this amazing event. Thank you.